Hello and welcome back for part 4 of our notes. This section will be diving into absolutism as it relates to Russia. Now, Russia in itself is a little bit more of a complex individual as it relates to their history, and we'll focus a little bit more on this in other sections of notes, but just to kind of give a quick overview. The czars are the political rulers or kings of Russia. And we see that Ivan the Terrible comes to power in 1533. During his younger years, there's a lot of political struggle between Ivan and the boyars, or the kind of nobles of Russia at this time that owned land in their empire. And this title of czar, or kind of like emperor, is self-imposed. Ivan at 16 gives himself this title, and we see that there is a lot of kind of instability in Russia because of this kind of conflict with the nobles of the boyars. There's what's known as the bad period during this time. He uses secret police basically to hunt down any traitors. Ivan kills his heir. His second son will take the throne, but will die without an heir. And Ivan basically gets this nickname of the Terrible because of the brutality that he runs Russia with. After he ends up dying, though, what we see is that there is a meeting because there's a power vacuum in Russia without a true heir, and this meeting decides who the next czar will be. Michael Romanov is named as the successor, and this essentially sets the Romanov dynasty in motion, basically until we get to the Russian Revolution in the early 20th century. When we look at Russian absolutism, though, we really have to look at it through the lens of Peter the Great, or Peter the First. He's known as the Great basically because of the big reforms that he puts into play in Russia. Again, we talked about the fact that Russia is a little bit of a different animal as it relates to what's going on in Europe, mainly because Russia is on the fringe. Part of Russia and part of the Russian Empire is in Asia. We see that kind of the Russian culture looks much different than in Europe at this time. They're still using serfdom, this idea of these individuals that basically are tied to the land as workers. So we see that they're still in more of a medieval kind of culture and economy moving forward. Where does this really come to? It's the fact that Russia's basically cut off. They don't experience a lot of the advancement in Europe that comes from the Renaissance, as well as exploration of the New World, mainly because they're more connected to Constantinople, and then later when that becomes Istanbul, in what is now modern-day Turkey, than what we saw with the western portions of the Roman Empire and those connections to places in Western Europe. There's a lot of geographic issues as well with Russia that made it very difficult, one of which being the fact that it's just far away from the rest of Western Europe. So these ideas that would spread throughout Western Europe really didn't always make their way to Russia. In addition to all of this, Russia religiously was much different from Western Europe because of their main religion being Eastern Orthodoxy, a branch of Christianity that split off a significantly long time ago, but was essentially not affected by the struggles between the Catholics and the Protestants of the Reformation. Peter the Great really changes Russia, though, and this really happens because he goes and explores Western Europe. And he's determined when he comes back to Russia to basically create a new Russia that is much more Western and much more European. Now, the problem was that Russia was more of a medieval state, for lack of a better way of phrasing it at this point in time. The boyars were basically feudal nobles that had land. We still had serfdom, and they didn't experience a lot of the changes that Western Europe did. And Peter knows that in order to basically change this, he needs to consolidate his power, just as the monarchs of Western Europe had. One of the first ways that he does this is he takes the Russian Orthodox Church and puts it under state control. There's something called the Holy Synod that is run, and he essentially controls, but they then control church affairs so that he has basically final say over what goes on. He decides to also create another power dynamic by recruiting the noblemen that were kind of considered to be lower ranking in society. So the higher or more wealthy or important boyars were not necessarily recruited for these positions, but the lower ones were. They were given positions of authority to kind of empower them in exchange for loyalty. And this was, again, done to consolidate power under Peter. Just like the other absolute monarchs, he uses the military as well. He increases the size of it. He starts using the weaponry of the Western Europeans, as well as actual soldiers that are brought in as mercenaries, basically to teach and train these soldiers of Russia so that he could have a modern army as well. Again, Russia kind of goes through a major change at this point in time. Something as crazy and simple as introducing potatoes into the diet, okay, something that's going to be a staple for Russian food and beverage moving forward, is a huge change that would not have been part of Russian society at this time, even though these things had been imported from the New World since the kind of beginning of the Columbian Exchange. He decides to start a Russian newspaper as well, again, to try to spread new ideas and to spread information, things that were written down using printing presses. Women are given a little bit more rights at this time, that they're allowed to attend social gatherings. Nobles, they had to change their fashion, moving away from kind of the traditional the traditional Russian style to more of the Western fashion styles. We see education opportunities open up, schools of navigation, like the Portuguese had for hundreds of years, as well as these kind of academies for the arts and sciences as well. The big key here being that Russia needed to educate their populace in order to advance. They also needed to make sure that people were not leaving Russia, because they wanted to make sure that the ideas about what Russia would become were still controlled by the state, even though they needed to advance them. So people were not allowed to leave Russia to study at this time either. In our last part, we'll talk a little bit more about the monarchy in England and the role of the English Civil War in the history of this time period as it relates to kind of the politics and civic engagement. So thanks again, and we'll listen in for part 5.